various social media outlets. We welcome your questions through the chat channel, and we will be addressing them after 45 minutes of conversation. One of the interesting things is that Zoom does not have Arabic as one of the languages for translation. So you will have to tune into Korean to get the simultaneous translation in Arabic. As we get adjusted to this new world of internet hiccups, Korean for Arabic, the most important thing is that we can hear from our speakers who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to help us navigate these times. First, we have Jihad Azour, Director of IMF Middle East and Central Asia Department, Dame Minouche Shafik, who's Director of the LSC, Marwan Muasher, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Jordan, and Monica Malik, Chief Economist at Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. All of them have very long, both accomplished bios and histories, but I will just give you their immediate titles. For background, the IMF has just issued its regional economic outlook update, and in it to try to help us navigate what the economic outlook for this year and next year look like. Without any further delay, I turn to you, Jihad, to talk to us about the implications of the economic recession that we're facing in 2020 for the region, but also the possible risks to recovery. Jihad, over to you.
Mina, thank you very much. And I would like to say good morning or good afternoon to all the speakers who I'm glad to be with, and also the participants that we will dialogue with during this an hour and a half. As Mina said, we have issued 2 days ago our update for the Regional Economic Outlook for this year, which is an unusual way because usually we do it one in the spring and one in October. This year, because of it's a year like no other, we had to do another comprehensive update in the middle of the year. I will spend a few minutes in order to maybe look back and analyze what has happened over the last few months. What does it mean and how we see the next half of the year, and what are the key challenges that we think are important both for us and also for policymakers to look after. First of all, we started the year with, I would say, fairly positive outlook, driven by oil exporting countries, with the oil price at $68 the barrel, with a balanced matrix of risk. And then we had the outbreak of the coronavirus shock that affected our country extensively. First, it affected the region through trade, especially that the region is, in terms of trade links, very much oriented to trade with Asia. But very rapidly, one of the epicenters of the COVID pandemic was in the region, which was Lebanon, and created a new challenge for the region, how to manage a new type of crisis, a healthcare crisis, in a region where we have a disparity in healthcare system. Therefore, first shock was related to trade. Second one was related to direct impact of the COVID-19 that drove with it the oil price. Of course, when you have a decline of trade, which is expected this year to be in a minus of 12%, this has led to a sharp decline in oil price that has reached lowest level in the last 2 decades in real terms, rates that were not seen since 1973. With that came a rapid response by governments in order to address the healthcare shock. And we saw here countries coming rapidly and swiftly with strong containment measures in order to control the expansion of the pandemic, which in itself led to gradual lockdown of the economy. What does all that mean? It means the following. One, this crisis had a massive impact on growth because we had to revise twice our growth prospect for this year, the first one in April and the second one now in July. But I would say the second element that we saw, that countries were able to react quickly were able to react with strong measures that have helped most of the countries of the region, despite their challenges and the disparity in the healthcare system, to contain and to control the spreading of the pandemic and to save lives of their citizens. Compared to Europe or to the US or Latin America, the rates of fatality is 1 to 8 or 1 to 9. And this is something that I think it's an important element going forward to build on. The second element to also that we have witnessed is countries also came very quick in setting a certain number of policy response. And they were in three folds. One is protecting lives. And we saw a massive increase in spending on healthcare, social, and protecting livelihoods. And this was in form of social transfers, support to livelihood. Yet the issue here that came as one of the key challenges is with the high level of informality, governments were not able to access some of those who were in deep need for support. And especially in the case where we have high level of internally displaced or refugees. The second set of policies was to protect and provide the floor to the economy. And here government introduced certain number of fiscal measures, both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side. On average, governments of the region introduced a package of around 2% of GDP, which is comparable to other EMs, I would say is on the low side, and reflects somehow the lack of fiscal space that many countries have currently in the region. The third set of policies were on the monetary and on the financial side. Adjustment in interest rate by 150 basis points. And also we saw an injection of liquidities that varied between one country to another. All these measures helped protect the economy, but did not prevent the economy from shrinking. And therefore, we expect this year that most of the economies in the Middle East and North Africa will endure negative growth. Of course, oil exporting countries will face bigger challenge in terms of growth outlook because the drop in oil price drove the oil sector, but also the nature of the non-oil sector was affected by the crisis itself because most of those countries are linked to the global value chain through trade, through transport, through airline and other type of service sectors. Therefore, the adjustment for oil exporting is going to be larger this year. And the response, as we saw it, was differentiated. Some countries resorted to additional expansion and others, in fact, reallocated their fiscal package within the same envelope. We also expect for the oil importing countries to have negative growth, but with high disparity between countries. Therefore, adjustment in the outlook downward this year, and we project that next year we will have a recovery. The recovery is not going to be as strong as we expected it a few months ago, and this is due to few factors. One is the uncertainty that is still very high, and also the feeling that the risk of a second round of the pandemic is still around the corner. And we saw almost 60% of our countries opening up, and yet the pandemic is still with us, and then we're still facing some new cases. This recovery also depends on how the oil price and the oil market will perform. We are expecting the possibility of extending the OPEC Plus agreement that has reduced the volume of production and export, which has led to a slight recovery in the oil price, but in terms of revenues, has negatively impacted the revenues of the region. To give you an order of magnitude, oil exporting countries will lose $270 billion this year in terms of oil revenues. Another positive element that came in the last few months, we saw countries accessing again the international financial markets. Since the pandemic, 60% of the issuance of sovereign in the EM, in the emerging market group, came from the region. Started with the high-rating countries like Saudi, UAE, and Qatar. But recently we saw Jordan, we saw Egypt, and we saw Bahrain coming to the market. yet at, I would say, higher spreads, and very much dependent on the mood of investors that is in itself dependent on the global behavior of the financial markets. Therefore, regaining access to market was an additional, I would say, positive development, but comes with high level of uncertainty. This first 6 months also showed us or exacerbated some of the vulnerabilities that the region is facing. One, some countries who have entered the crisis with weak fundamentals saw additional challenge in their ability to design policies to weather the shock. And this is going to be a challenging point, especially that the average debt for oil importing countries will move up to 95% of GDP this year. This is, of course, a global trend. We see increase in debt globally, but for countries of the region, this is in addition to limited fiscal space, it constrains their ability to navigate the recovery. The second element we saw, I mentioned it earlier, the vulnerabilities in terms of social. One of the dimensions is the informal sector that represent traditionally the source of resilience, but with the crisis, it became one of the key elements of weaknesses. Here, a silver lining emerged. Various countries use technology, digital, as a way to access this group. And I think this is an element for the future. Maybe later in the discussion, we can develop our thoughts on that. Another group is the group of internally displaced and refugees. The region hosts the largest number of refugees in the world. And they were able to save their lives in the first wave. But I think this is something that needs to scale up healthcare infrastructure. To give you an example, in a country like Yemen, you have 0.7 bed per 1,000 people. Usually it should be at least 2.7 or 3 bed per 1,000 people. Therefore, we need to scale up, or the region needs to scale up spending on healthcare. We need also to move from direct social transfer to a broader social protection and social contract framework. And I think this is a challenge, but also an opportunity for the region. In terms of recovery, clearly there are certain sectors who face risk of dislocation, like tourism, for example, like airline or some other sectors that are job-rich. And countries started to adjust to those, but this will take some time for those countries to address their challenges. Countries like Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, or Lebanon are dependent on those. Remittances is also an important issue. To give you an order of magnitude, 18% of the global remittances come from GCC. The other 18% come from Europe. And those are the two main sources of remittances for many countries in the region. Going forward, we need to think how we can address the issue of labor. Last point that I will stop here. I think what has emerged as an encouraging sign is the capacity to work together. For example, from our side as a fund, we have been able to scale up, as you know, rapidly our support to the region. We provided $17 billion financial support, including grants to countries like, for example, Yemen or Somalia. And this is the largest increase in our lending capacity in 1 year. But also we had engaged with other IFIs and regional institutions in joint forces approaching those issues. And also we have increased the level of discussion with the authorities on how to design their policies. And I think going forward, this is an important element. That the thing that we need to avoid going forward is, I would say, the 3D risks. Denial, because this is usually the tendency is to deny that there is a crisis. Delay in the response and doing a bit too little, too late. And distortion. Sometimes we start on the right footing, but policies get distorted because of the political economy environment. In a nutshell, I would say on the pluses, the region was able to address one of the really challenging healthcare situation in the right response that had helped protect lives and livelihoods. there is a clear resolve that I see in my interaction with various leaders and policymakers to not waste time and to accelerate the transformation of their economies. I think this is a challenge that requires, on one hand, additional thinking, and I hope that in the discussion today we will address some of those quite key questions, but also it requires fast policy response to that. With that, I would thank you, and over to you, Mina.
Thank you so much, Jihad. I love the 3Ds of avoiding denial, delay, and distortion. Perhaps those are guiding principles to take us through the coming period. Minouche, I'd like to turn to you. Jihad has given us an overview for the region, the oil importing countries, the oil exporting countries. In some ways, we have a lot of similarities in the region, but we also have a lot of differences between what different countries' circumstances are. And we have fragile countries and those who are having to deal with conflict. And so how do those countries, the fragile countries, those who don't have any of the liquidity movement available, or those who are undergoing conflict or suffering from conflict, how do they deal with these current challenges?
Well, thank you, Mina, and thank you, Jihad, for that very comprehensive assessment of the outlook for the region. I think for fragile states, it's clear that imposing a generalized lockdown is just not viable. The risk to livelihoods is just too great. At the London School of Economics, we have something called the International Growth Center, and they pulled together 20 world-leading economists to develop a guidance note on how fragile states could cope with COVID-19. And I would recommend it because it's short and it's very precise and it's very practical. But they focus a lot on the importance of data. And I know data is scarce in fragile states, but it's a lot cheaper to collect data than to impose a generalized lockdown. And the reason data is so critical is that it enables you to impose local lockdowns when there are outbreaks and enables you to target your health spending on those areas that need it most. So I think for fragile states, using a data-driven approach is key. I think the other thing is that we know that basic hygiene and hand washing is vital for fighting this, and that is an affordable intervention alongside simple kind of common sense interventions to avoid transmission, like banning large-scale public events. I think the other key thing, which Jihad alluded to, is that many countries in the region now have effective cash transfer schemes, which are able to get small amounts of income to poor households directly at very low administrative costs. And it seems to me that those kind of targeted cash transfer schemes providing minimum social protection, particularly in areas that are particularly hard hit by the virus, is another low cost and effective intervention that would work in fragile environments.
Can I ask about your point of the difficulties of having general lockdowns, especially for those countries where a substantial amount of the population is either part of the informal economy or relies on day wages? If a second wave comes, a stronger wave, God forbid, comes and hits these countries, what do they do if they haven't built in the data collection that you've spoken of, or they haven't really come to terms with how to avoid that general lockdown?
I mean, I think that the time to prepare to avoid that problem is now. And having in place mechanisms to collect that data to deal with more localized problems is you know, it's one of those distortions that people make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, I'll just not do anything and deal with it later. It'll cost so much more if you have to impose an across-the-board lockdown on an economy or on a region or on a city. And so I think it's a false economy not to try and give yourself the tools to take a more targeted approach.
Thank you. Marwan, I want to come to you to follow on from these points about the need for policies that balance between lives and livelihoods, especially for those countries that are fragile or that don't have the buffer of having immediate economic spending that can help bolster the economy?
Well, I think, thank you very much, Mina. I think we need to differentiate between policies that dealt with the short term in terms of making sure you protected lives. And as Jihad said, I think the region has done fairly well in protecting lives. Policies that have to do with protecting livelihoods is a different matter altogether. Let's remember that COVID-19 is at least the third major crisis to hit the region in a decade. You know, we had to deal with the Arab uprisings, and then we had to deal with 2014 and beyond with the decline in oil prices. This is the third major crisis, and if a second wave hits, that would be a fourth major crisis in 10 years. And there, I think, you know, you cannot talk about a magic wand. There is no magic wand that will basically mitigate all the problems that are associated with this. I think the region needs to move in 5 areas that I would like to quickly outline. First, it has to move from exclusion to inclusion and adopt policies of inclusion. That would be my main recommendation, if there is one. Jihad talked about social contracts. There has never been a time where social contracts are more needed, ones that are negotiated among different parts of society and between these the parts of society and the state. We need to move from rentier economies to productive economies, from patronage to productivity, if you want. I know that's easier said than done, but the oil era in the Arab world is over. And countries, you know, both oil importing countries and oil exporting countries need to understand that from now on, you need a different model of economic activity. We need to move from rote learning to preparing citizens. Our educational systems just do not prepare citizens to deal with the complexities of life. I'm not even talking about preparing them for the marketplace, preparing them for dealing with the complexities of life. COVID-19 is one such complexity. It's not going to be the only such complexity in the future. The fourth area is, I'd say, we need to move from monism to pluralism. Understand that diversity is a source of strength in Arab societies. We need to recognize that citizens are resources to nurture and not potential threats that must be coerced. And there we need to talk about equality among all citizens, regardless of gender, religion, economic background, etc. And the fifth area that I think we need to move to is to pivot towards Arab economic integration. All the studies have shown that integration has a demonstratively positive effect on growth, on unemployment, and on production. But none of this has been done in the past. Whether these areas are going to be acted upon by Arab states is still an open question. A lot of people are pessimistic whether Arab states are going to, do what it takes in order to leave business as usual and deal with the complexities of the 21st century, by adopting 21st century solutions and not 20th century solutions. That remains to be seen, but these are some of the areas that the Arab world needs to move on. They are all long-term. I will leave the economists to talk about the short-term policies that they need to take, but this is not going to be enough unless we understand that there is a big picture, that business as usual cannot be sustained unless the Arab world understands that. I'm afraid that the future will continue to look bleak.
Thank you for your points. I just want to do a quick follow-up because a lot of these issues we've discussed before, the need for the Arab world to make these important changes. But you've been in government yourself, and you know how long change takes, and also the complexities of these kinds of policies being implemented. At a time of crisis, can it become a catalyst to actually push through some of these difficult policies? Or does crisis mean that people are entrenched and too scared to actually take these bold moves?
So far, what we have seen, unfortunately, Mina, is a move towards authoritarianism, more authoritarianism. You know, a lot of Arab countries are arguing that because they have been successful at mitigating the health issues, the short-term issues, that they can project that and apply that to socioeconomic problems. It is one thing again, I want to emphasize, it is one thing to deal with the health aspects in an authoritarian way, in a centralized way, but it's quite another to deal with the socioeconomic aspects in the same sort of centralized way. People have to be brought in order to feel that they are part of the solution and not just the problem. Otherwise, and we can talk about this later if you want, otherwise, centralized approaches might be a formula for social unrest.
Thank you for that. Moving on to a very important aspect of course, the Arab world is the oil markets. And whether you are oil producing or oil importing, oil prices here are followed quite closely, and not just by policymakers and economists, but even by regular people and how it will impact their lives. So, Monica, I want to turn to you. At the start of the year, we had quite turbulent times with oil prices globally, and people were following what that means. What is your take on the near and medium term outlook for oil stability, and how will that impact the economies of the region?
Very much, Mina. Well, certainly oil has moved back into a far more comfortable zone than we had seen in the depths of the crisis in April, where we saw in some cases for WTI negative oil prices and Brent falling below $20 a barrel. But for the region, the current oil price is still well below the budget break-even oil prices and a comfortable level for the economies from a fiscal stance. At the moment, oil has been trading in a relatively tight band, Brent crude between $40 and $45 a barrel. And in the near term, that's the range that we expect it to see it remaining in. In a case, global environment, where you see COVID controlled and global demand continuing to pick up, global economic activity continuing to pick up, we expect oil by the end of this year and moving into next year to move towards the $50 a barrel range. But as has been highlighted throughout this call so far, there's a lot of global uncertainties. A number of countries haven't controlled their first wave. We're seeing rises in other places, such as the US as well. So there's a lot of global uncertainty to the oil price outlook. One key factor that's going to remain a headwind is the sharp increase in inventories that we saw build in the first 5 months of the year. So even though with the production cuts and pickup in demand as global economies start opening up and starting to see activity pick up, the headwind will really be the inventories. We do expect the supply-demand mismatch to reverse from July, where demand outstrips supply thanks to the supply cuts in a large way. Another factor is also the pace of readjustment in the US shale production. And if we see oil prices rising too fast, we might not see the full adjustment in production in the US that the OPEC Plus partners are looking for.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that just in terms of your outlook for demand outstripping supply. Of course, the OPEC Plus agreement has been very important. Do you think that will continue? Do you see that agreement being seen through for the foreseeable future?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's very, very important for the OPEC Plus agreement, especially from the Gulf perspective, is the strong compliance overall. Countries such as Russia implementing such deep cuts, which wasn't the case with the first OPEC Plus agreement. And of course, in the last few months, you actually saw key GCC producers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait implementing deeper cuts. The other very positive thing about the OPEC Plus agreement is that we've got a production outlook that goes past a year. So they've given a very forward-looking stance. And I think if we see demand-side pressures emerging again, the core producers, especially the core GCC producers, will adjust production to support the oil price. Overnight, we had the announcement that the output cuts will be tapered, so we will see some increases, but I think it's going to be a working in progress movement. Depending on how global recovery develops, production will adjust to that.
Thank you very much. Jihad, I want to ask you about the issue of rising debt, because one of the things that will come out from 2020 for sure is that countries will have greater debts. How does that impact the region?
Well, of course, the situation here, Mina, is different between the oil importing and the oil exporting countries. Oil importing countries who middle-income countries have already seen their level of debt going up. I mentioned earlier, the average debt will reach 95% of GDP. This is not something that is typical for the region this year. Most of the countries in the world will see their debt going up. The issue is this: in the current environment for those countries, is limiting their ability to use the fiscal instrument as a way to amortize some of the shock, but also allocate the needed resources to strengthen their healthcare and social infrastructure on one hand and prepare for the recovery. And this is why it's very important to not to wait too long in order to start focusing on, in addition to the key focus that should remain on protecting lives, on how to shield the economy from a deep recession and how to prepare the recovery. I would like, if you allow me, to go and echo 2 points that were raised. One by Minouche on the issue of fragile states. I totally agree that we need to be innovative in order to provide support to those. Technology could play an important role in that, in order to provide information, in order to provide support. And it doesn't need to be sophisticated technology. Even cheap technology, basic technology could help, and also could help improve the quality of information that is, and I totally agree, badly needed for that. The second element that I would like to highlight on the fragile group is the importance of remittances. They constitute on average between 12 to 14% of GDP. And those are lifelines that are at risk this year. And this is why we believe that it is important to move globally and collectively in a way to help low-income countries, fragile states this year by providing them with additional grants, providing them with additional support. This is what we have done at the fund with the grant, limited grant that we have. We provided a few countries in the region with that, but it's not enough. The global community need to do more. There is this G20 initiative that goes in the right direction, but I think this is something that it is important to highlight, especially that this year is going to be different and difficult, especially most of the providers of aid and support are also facing issues in their home economy. And this is something that we need to keep an eye on. Another point that Marwan raised on the issue of inclusion versus exclusion. I think inclusion needs to come this year with resilience, because we saw an erosion of resilience for the middle income, low income people. And usually those, historically, when we look at previous crises, those are the ones who would recover with longer lag of time. And this is where we saw most of the increase in social unrest. Some of the social unrest we saw goes back to issues that were not addressed on time. Like, for example, the 2008 crisis, that we underestimated its impact on the region. Also, I agree on 2 other elements, and I will put them differently. I think transparency and fighting corruption is going to be very important. This is a way to show that public money is being used in the right way, and also that citizens are participating through getting access not only to information, but also to the decision In addition, I think also on that aspect, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have been, and Minouche knows it, and also Marwan has participated with us and others on how to increase inclusion and how to create inclusive growth. We know where the issues are. Youth unemployment is high, women participation is low. Increasing women participation will bring trillions of dollars to the region in 10 years. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. A recovery that is technology-based will allow the 65% of the population who are below 30 to thrive and drive growth. Green recovery is an area where the region will benefit. We are sharing scarce resources in water, environment, and we can preserve them. In addition to the regional integration, there are certain number of also silver linings. We saw certain sectors coming back. We saw agriculture becoming more interesting than before. We saw, for example, in countries' capacity to adjust very quickly. We have some anecdotal evidence of companies in Morocco, for example, readjusting very quickly to serve the European market in order to have first line of response. And in the plan that EU, for example, of the 750 billion euro of stimulus, those countries could benefit, and we should help them to benefit from that. This is where I think the multilateral approach, the approach that put stakeholders around the same table, we as institutions, policymakers, thinkers, or I would say major opinion leaders, I think this is the time where we need to work all together in order to help countries address those issues. This is more challenging than any of the crises we saw. If we go back 100 years, we did not have this same magnitude of shock and the breadth of this shock. But I think here too, I would think that the ability that countries showed in protecting lives can be translated into an ability to reconsider the current framework and to do a paradigm shift in the way they manage some of the key elements. In a recent study we did that we are going to publish in a few weeks on social spending, it's clear that the region increased social spending over the last 2 decades, but yet it's not enough. And I think social protection, social safety net in terms of protecting labor, investing in education, especially technical education for those who need to be relocated, because we need to do some relocation of resources in terms of capital resources and human resources. This could be a way to bring to the market millions of young people through education. And now with technology, remote education is easy to develop. Therefore, I think it's very important to consider this as a shock that could allow many of the good ideas that were not implemented in the past to find their time now and see them implemented. I wouldn't think that we need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel has been invented. Now we need to put it in motion.
Thank you, Jihad. Yes, I believe one of the few silver linings that have come out from the pandemic is seeing the ability to make quick decisions that before would seem almost impossible. Flexible working, education, online education that people would not take seriously now suddenly are seen as instrumental to economic recovery. So Minouche, I want to come to you and say those quick decisions that had to be made across the board could provide a catalyst for actually getting the economy moving, if not in the short term, at least in the medium and long term. But the structural issue of unemployment, youth unemployment, we've been speaking about at least for the last 15, 20 years. How do we face that particular challenge in addition to kind of the changes that we see and the enterprise actions that we saw happening in the last few months?
I very much take your point about, suddenly quick decisions could be made. At the London School of Economics, I often joke that it would have taken me 10 years to persuade the faculty to move any courses online. And we did it in a week because we had no choice. And it worked. And now suddenly it's opened up a whole a whole set of possibilities that we're exploring more rigorously. So definitely, crises open up possibilities. I think on the issue you raise around youth unemployment, I think at the moment the region has in some ways the worst of all possible worlds in terms of the policy framework around labor markets. There's a very small group of workers in the formal sector who have very high levels of protection, and there's very little flexibility for employers if they need to change their labor force. And then you have a huge number of workers in the informal sector with no benefits, very high flexibility. They can lose their job tomorrow and have no job security, and very little social protection. And this kind of dual labor market structure is thwarting job creation, because it keeps people informal, it keeps them with no protection, and it discourages employers from creating jobs in the formal sector, because once you've hired someone, it's really difficult if circumstances change for you to change that. And perhaps this shock might open up the debate about how do we bring more people into the formal labor market, make it a more flexible formal labor market, but in parallel, produce social protection in terms of unemployment insurance and active labor market policy, so that those workers who do lose their jobs get support to get into new jobs. It's interesting, just an interesting factoid. The countries in Europe that have the highest turnover of workers who lose their jobs and move to new jobs and lose their jobs are, you would be surprised to hear, Sweden and Denmark. Countries that we think of as having very high levels of employment protection. They don't. They have very flexible labor markets, but once people lose their job, they know that they'll very quickly be able to get into another job because they'll go through training, or the people are incentivized to create new jobs. So I would love to see the region use this opportunity to move toward a more flexible formal sector labor market with much better employment protection for all workers, not just the ones in the formal sector.
Thank you. I think this idea of flexible formal workforce would appeal to many people in the region. Another point I wanted to ask you, Minouche, about is remittances. Now, this is not, of course, just related to the region, but globally, we've seen the impact on remittances. There are countries like India that will be hugely impacted by the loss of jobs and people going home at this time. What's the outlook for remittances? How do you think that we can recover some of that money flow around the world?
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, I think Jihad or Monica may have other things to add on the remittance debate. I mean, I think, it is so intimately linked to what happens to travel and people's ability to move. And I think the path of remittances is really contingent on the path of the virus, and whether mobility across countries will be restored and when.
Thank you. Monica, I guess I will put that question also to you.
That's going to be one of the key headwinds from this crisis, because talking from a Gulf perspective, even though we've had a number of fiscal packages and more so monetary packages introduced, most of this initial response has been to try and limit a deeper recession than just from the COVID impact. So one from corporates going out of business and unemployment, which would really extend the crisis and the depth of the crisis. But despite these measures, what you are seeing is job losses, a lot of these in externally facing sectors, which are vulnerable, as Minouche said, particularly areas such as airlines, hotels, hospitality, everything related to travel. And even though we've started seeing economies opening up, especially long-haul flights, long-haul destinations is going to probably be the thing that comes back the furthest in time. So despite all the measures, we are seeing sort of job losses, and we think that's going to be a key headwind, not only for the Gulf, but for the remittances going back, the ability to attract FDI in a globally weak and uneven recovery outlook. So I think it's going to be one of the key challenges. And, of course, as a region, we're very externally facing. So, one of the key steps for that to pick up for our growth to pick up is the external recovery. And then we need to work on various policy measures to try and develop the resilience of the economy, the depth of the economy, which has been one of the key factors really heightening this impact on us.
Thank you very much. We have so many questions from people listening in. So although I have a long list of questions myself, I'm going to start turning to the questions from our audience. And the first one is to you, Marwan, which is regarding the possibility of a currency union in the Arab world to help, one, of course, help with the cooperation, but also with economic integration. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, Mina, I'm not an economist to comment on these things. I mean, Jihad and Minouche are far better able to do that. One thing is clear is this region needs to be more integrated economically, whether it's a currency union, whether it's labor movement, whether it's trade among Arab countries. This region is not trading with itself. And I think the figure is like 7% of all trade happens in between Arab countries, and the rest of the trade happens outside. So a currency union from a layman's point of view, I think will help, but Jihad can better address that than me. I do think, like I said, that integration is the way forward. It requires some political decisions, but its effect on growth and on unemployment has been proven so far.
We have another question.
Let me, Mina, if I may also comment on the unemployment issue, because the Arab countries need to move from a welfare state model. That welfare state model has been possible because of oil. Now that the oil era is over, it is clear that Arab economic systems need to move from a model where the state is the principal provider of jobs in both oil exporting and oil importing countries to a model where the private sector needs to pick up that that responsibility. For the private sector to do that, we need a better education system. We need a better legislative system that encourages job creation, that encourages small and medium enterprises. This is the way forward, where the state will, have to pick up providing basic services like health, education, transportation, and provide a safety net for those that are not privileged, but move away from being the principal provider of jobs. And I hope that this crisis is going to accelerate that move, which is self-evident, but which has not really moved much before the corona crisis.
Can I ask you, I mean, one of the questions that's posed to us, and I think you probably hear this anecdotally quite a bit, that these solutions that are almost out there, but difficult to get the political will for it. How can we actually see this getting implemented? Does it have to be country by country, and then maybe you can get smaller agreements that can become region-wide? How do you foresee it?
Well, there is a reason why these have not been implemented. Patronage systems are not just economic systems, they're political ones as well. Many Arab countries have built basically rentier layers around them that are beneficiaries of this system. To move away from this system into systems that are more economically productive means that you need to adjust the constituencies that you have, means that you have to stop giving patronage and start to treat people on their merit. And that's very much a political issue, not just an economic issue. We might, the region might not have a choice because of the decline in oil prices, because of all the economic difficulties that it is undertaking. It might not have a choice but to adopt such measures. Unfortunately, I will add, we are not yet seeing any indication that Arab countries are moving in that direction. I'm still hoping that this crisis might push them to do that.
Thank you. Jihad, I have a question from you, from one of the audience members, about stimulus packages in the region. What are your thoughts on the stimulus packages that have happened? You addressed that they're not as high as in other parts of the world, but they have been seen. And how long should they last?
Well, we saw different types of policy packages. The first one is the traditional one, which is the fiscal one. There is a diversity between countries. We saw countries introducing packages the size of 5-6% of GDP, like Bahrain or Iran. Others with the very minimal packages. But I think it's very important to put things in context. For example, in the GCC, you have already for their local citizens, they have a wide range of social protection, and therefore they may not need the same increase in social protection that maybe in other places in the world. The second lever that was used, that was activated faster, was the financial one. Through liquidity injection, we saw several central banks coming in very quickly, providing additional liquidity support through the banking system, providing additional cut in interest rates. In certain countries like Egypt, it went down by 400 to 500 basis point cumulative. Therefore, the idea here was to provide liquidity to small and medium-sized companies, provide certain number of forbearance in order to give some space to the SMEs. We recommend to countries on that to be targeted and also to have timely measures. Targeted in the sense to help those who really need it, and timely in the way you put them in action, and timely in the way you unwind them. If you put them in action after, I would say, the shock, their impact would be limited. And if you remove them very quickly, also you may create additional issues. But if you keep them, you create dependence. Therefore, the strategy is keep moving on the two tracks. One is focus on how to stabilize a situation that is still very volatile on the healthcare side, which means support of social nature are still important. How to allow companies in a partial reopening formula to keep their engines working. And in parallel, how to start from now planning the recovery that will bring the additional 1, 2, 3%. This is different between oil exporting and oil importing countries, because oil exporting countries have been subjected to different type of, I would say, risks or dislocations. They were very active in transportation, in airline, in shipping. Those sectors were affected. Therefore, they need to protect those. Their model of diversification also could be amended in order to infuse more technology in it, to allow more startups to thrive. Improving the productivity of some of the SOEs and some of the government-related entities will create new space. In the oil importing arenas, here the situation is different. We have much more flexible economies because of the high level of informality or the large size of the SMEs. Yet, it's very important to allow those to maintain their capacity, especially that access to finance is still limited in those countries. It does not exceed for SMEs 6% of GDP, where usually in other parts of the emerging market category is above 16%. Therefore, we have here a potential to improve their financial inclusion. Marwan raised an important issue, which is regional integration. In fact, the first step is to remove regional barriers. Because when you see the amount of barriers that exist between countries, you see that it's very difficult for neighboring countries to trade or to do business together. Take the example of Maghreb countries, who share a lot of communalities culturally, etc. They are the lowest integrated in the world, even lower than sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, what is needed is only to remove some barriers, avoid having too much limitations, especially when it comes to technology and technology activities, because those in nature would not thrive with all these limitations, and try to see where complementarities are. We saw that agriculture, food security issues are becoming very important. Those issues, there is a lot of complementarities, and you have countries who have neglected that. Take Iraq, a country that has huge agricultural production, and that this is something that was not put to contribution. It can create jobs and also can improve the size of the non-oil GDP. I think there are plenty of opportunities that are waiting for decision makers to seize them. I don't think that we are lacking ideas, and what is needed today is the resolve and to put the various stakeholders around the same table. Minouche was mentioning an important element. Reforming the labor market is key. But now part of the reform of the labor market is building capacity, access to talent. What is going to be critical is access to talent. And access to talent will come through education, classical education and new ways of providing education. Therefore, I think we are in one of those crossroads that are very important. And it's important to seize this moment and move in the right direction.
Jihad, no speaking engagement for you is complete without somebody asking, of course, about Lebanon, your beloved Lebanon. So I have to ask you, several people have asked the question regarding your views on the current crisis in Lebanon, how to get out of it. Well, of course, I respect your IMF hat. People are very keen to hear from you about how Lebanon can emerge from the crisis it's in. And then after that, I'll turn to you, Marwan, also to please comment about the developments in Lebanon.
Well, Mina, thank you for this question. You know, I'm in my role a bit limited to speak about Lebanon, but what I can tell you is that Lebanese government put forward a reform plan that based on it, they have approached the fund for fund support. We at the fund have put a team to help Lebanon in this endeavor, and they have been meeting over the last 2 months with the authorities virtually, unfortunately, but in order to go into the details of this plan, see what needs to be done in terms of addressing the acute financial crisis that has led to, I would say, a social severe situation with a level of inflation that is unsustainable, and the sharp decline in the exchange rate and sharp decline in confidence. Of course, Lebanon is facing one of the most difficult economic hardship today that was compounded with the coronavirus shock. And I would say, at least I think on that, Lebanon was able to, despite the fact that it has limitation, despite the fact that Lebanon is hosting a large community of refugees, the Lebanese authorities were able to address the healthcare challenge, and they were able to prevent this disease from expanding and protecting lives of their citizens. What is needed is unity of purpose, as our managing director said a few weeks ago, behind those reforms, moving fast and regaining confidence, because where you start is first is to regain confidence.
Thank you. Marwan, if I can please pose the same question to you regarding Lebanon.
Sure, Mina. I have the freedom and privilege of saying what Jihad cannot say.
That's why I came to you.
But I studied in Lebanon. The Carnegie Regional Center is in Lebanon. I'm on the board of AUB, so Lebanon means a great deal to me. And I think this is a classic case of people knowing what needs to be done, but nobody having the will to do it. All the political forces in Lebanon keep postponing the inevitable. Lebanon is not impossible to remedy. Provided that the political forces understand that they cannot go on with business as usual. So far, that has not happened. Whether they are waiting for the country to crumble before they wake up or not is a question that nobody can answer at this point. I want to say, Mina, from another perspective, I want to also add, even though this is an economic maybe event, the diversity of the Middle East is under attack. And it is under attack in one of its last castles, one of its last bastions in the Orient. It has been under attack in Iraq. It has been under attack in Syria, where a lot of the religious and cultural diversity has been lost. Lebanon has been one of the last, places in the Mashriq where diversity has been exercised, political, cultural, religious. And if that diversity is no more, that is going to affect not just Lebanon as a country, it's going to affect the whole Middle East. And I think the international community has a responsibility to help Lebanon in this regard. But the Lebanese themselves have the biggest responsibility to understand that they are not just protecting their country, but they're protecting the cause of diversity in the region. And I hope that, the political forces in the country wake up before it's too late.
Yes, we all hope that indeed. And I think your point about pluralism and the diversity that Lebanon represents is so precious to Arabs and hopefully people of concern around the world. Thank you for that. Monica, I want to turn to you, and we're going to shift gears here a bit, because one of the questions that came through to us was about the non-oil sectors for the GCC. I think often people think of the Gulf Cooperation Council and they just think energy. But there are questions about how do you think the rest of the economy, especially, you have places that rely on tourism, that rely on events and so forth. How do you think the economy there, that sector or those sectors will recover in the GCC?
Well, I think it will take a long time, and I think it will be very much uneven as well. And I think this is what's something that's very unique about this crisis, because, of course, for the Gulf, there's always the discussion of diversification, and yes, that's very vital going forward. But in this crisis, the oil and the non-oil sector is going to be so hard hit. This crisis is like no other in the way that large sections of the economy have been shut down or are working at substantially below capacity levels. And that goes back to the root of this crisis. The previous, at least global crises, have very much stemmed from financial markets. And, then we've had monetary policy, fiscal policy that's helped to support it. But this really stems from a global pandemic. And the core of this crisis is that the economies have had to shut down to control the spread of this crisis. So as our panelists have mentioned before, that the control of the pandemic is going to be very, very critical. Most of our non-oil sectors are externally facing, and especially in the UAE, if you look at, it's a very open economy. It's intrinsically has quite a small population, so international demand is going to be very critical for that. And our view is that by the end of 2021, GCC GDP is still going to be below the levels that we saw at the end of 2019, not only because of oil, but because of the non-oil crisis. So for us, it's, again, looking at these sectors, trade, tourism. A critical point will really be a vaccine, or how efficiently we've controlled this. How quickly are we going to see people willing to fly, willing to take part in tourist activities? We've seen, for example, Dubai has opened up for international tourism from 7th of July. But until people feel comfortable and confident to travel, until people feel, confident to go out and consume and go to restaurants in whichever economy, you're going to see trade weak, you're going to see tourism weak. So it really goes back to the crux of this crisis, which is the control of COVID-19.
Monica, can I also do a follow-up question that's come from one of the members of the audience, which is about liquidity? He says that in some countries in the region, we're seeing liquidity being infused. Who are the beneficiaries for this? And also, what will be the impact on inflation?
Okay, well, on inflation, we see on the whole, a weak inflation backdrop really reflecting the fact that we've got spare capacity, particularly in real estate. That spare capacity is expected to increase now, and even in areas such as, in the service industries where you have to implement social distancing, we've got spare capacity there as well. The only country that really stands out is, of course, Saudi Arabia. From this month, we've had the tripling of VAT to 15%. And that's, of course, going to mean that inflationary pressures increase because of the reforms. That, in turn, will also slow down the pace of recovery going forward. Consumer spending, but also corporates as well, are going to be very impacted and absorb some of the cost of VAT as well. So, liquidity has increased, and the critical point, as Jihad had mentioned, is to make sure that corporates that are seeing significant disruptions to their revenue, the way they do business, have funding and liquidity in place to manage this short-term, hopefully, disruption. It's largely targeted towards corporates. A lot of countries are looking at supporting SMEs where access to funding has been very difficult, so reducing capital buffers required for SMEs and so on. And we're seeing different trends throughout the region. In UAE, we're seeing, for example, lending to GREs increasing quite substantially. But in other places, you're seeing, credit growth still remaining weak because there's still a lot of uncertainty on the demand, where we come back, what will the economic outlook look like going forward. So a lot of companies are not looking to leverage up when there's so much uncertainty with what the outlook will be in 2-3 months' time.
Thank you. Jihad, I want to come back to you. Monica raised the issue of Saudi VAT being tripled. We actually have a question from one of the audience members asking what your views are about the fiscal measures that Saudi Arabia has taken, from VAT increase to certain fees being imposed.
Well, Mina, our general principle here for oil exporting countries and also for others who have the capacity to, and the reserves, is to have the right balance between providing support to stabilize the economy and consolidating the public finance situation. We did not recommend in the case of Saudi, for example, to triple the VAT at this stage. But I think broadly speaking, achieving this objective is an important one. I think the sequence and the timing is going to be important. We are at a point where the economy is low and the economy needs to be stabilized and to help in the recovery. Demand went down and also supply went down. And this is also why this crisis is like no other, because it's multifaceted and it's affecting both supply and demand. It's affecting different parts of the economy. And therefore, it's still important at this stage to provide a kind of buffer to stabilize. It's important also to start looking at the balance sheet of the banking system to make sure that the risk of increase in non-performing loans is under control. This is another important dimension. And 3 is to look at the social safety net that exists already and see what maybe needs to be reallocated. Maybe now it's time to invest more in training, in capacity development for the young men and women in the GCC. to be prepared for the new type of jobs that they need. Therefore, I think we are looking closely, for example, to what the UAE government has done recently in terms of using extensively technology in the service provision and the protection of citizens when it comes to fighting the COVID-19, etc. And even in the terms and the way the government is organized to be more proactive and learn from the lessons of dealing with this COVID-19 shocks. I think the situation that is today need to be analyzed country by country, because in addition to Saudi or UAE, there are countries who have maybe less buffers, and those cannot wait before making sure that the public finance situation is stabilized.
I have one more question from the audience regarding taxes and whether you expect, Jihad, to see further taxation in the region, and especially on the digital economy. As we see more and more people moving to the digital economy, we see higher taxation on it in the region.
We're talking here globally or only in GCC? Because the taxation system is different.
In the region.
I think the tax system can be improved by being more progressive and build in it some additional solidarity, because income disparity in the region is still very high, and there is a value of making the tax system more progressive. There is also a value of making the tax system more efficient, because we still have a lot of special regimes, exceptions that erode the tax space and narrow it. And I think it's an opportunity to address that. It's not wise at this stage to increase tax on consumption, especially in countries where the level of income is low, because this will create additional regression and additional pressure. Therefore, yes, it's an important moment to look at the fiscal from a reform standpoint. Countries who have the capacity to weigh between both parts of the equation, which is provide stimulus, but at the same time make sure that their fiscal is sustainable, have more time to do it. Others don't, especially those who have high level of debt. But instead of going to the easy measures, which is to increase maybe tax on consumption or keep an inefficient system of spending, I think this is the right opportunity to introduce additional fairness, additional efficiency, use more technology as a way to provide services, be more transparent in the way public money is being used, and also look at the expenditure matrix and see how this expenditure matrix needs to be reorganized. Countries who don't have additional space, they can still reallocate in the same envelope and put priority more to social spending. Last but not the least, I think infrastructure is going to be also an important driver, because we saw recently, or I wouldn't say recently, over the last decade, decline in investment in infrastructure, decline in FDIs, investment in smart technology, like, for example, greening the recovery with a lot of investment in decarbonizing the economy, in building more climate resilient societies. This is a new avenue. Using technology and allow technology to thrive and expand. This is also another avenue. Therefore, it may not be the right time to add additional tax or burden on a sector that could, in fact, drive the recovery. Therefore, yes, also in terms of revisiting the fiscal framework, the way also we manage the monetary policy, the way we can scale up, as Minouche was saying earlier, the capacity through information to have more informed decisions. Those are important avenues that we need to explore further in the region.
Thank you very much, Jihad. I'm going to take, this is the last question that I'm taking from the audience because we have less than 15 minutes to close this session. So the final question, Marwan, I'd like you to please address it, which is regarding education. The question says, education has been heavily emphasized especially where it comes to developing digitally based economies. Which countries are doing the best in terms of introducing needed changes to the educational systems? Which countries are making the effort? Are there best practices you can tell us about from what you've seen in the region?
When I talk about education, Mina, I don't just limit it to technology and bringing in technology into the program, as important as that is. And in fact, many Arab countries have done well in bringing technology into the classroom. They need to do more. What I'm talking about is the value system. Educational systems in the Arab world are largely rote learning systems. They impart, very narrowly defined sort of package of information at the expense of critical thinking, at the expense of research, at the expense of understanding that truths are relative and not absolute. These are basic skills for the 21st century, because as we talk, the market is changing. And what you learn today in the classroom might not be relevant 4 years down the road. What stays relevant is your ability to adjust, is your ability to keep learning and teaching yourself so that you adjust with the adjusting conditions. Which countries are doing that? I'm not sure any. There are pockets. There are pockets here and there. There are pockets in Lebanon. There are pockets in Tunisia. But has a country adopted an educational system that imparts these values systematically and consistently all over the curricula? I'm not sure any Arab country has done that.
Yeah, I think your point on values and actually what young people are being taught, but also the ability for true critical thinking will be the only way we can take the region forward. We have many more questions, and first of all, I apologize to those whose questions I couldn't take. I also apologize that my internet decided to crash at the very beginning of this conversation. So despite the bumps, Minouche had to leave us a little early. Despite the bumps, this has been a fascinating conversation. Everything from Jihad's points of avoiding denial, delay, and distortion, to all of the speakers saying that certain countries in the region, most of the countries in the region, were very good at actually dealing with the immediate protection of lives. And I think that's something that has to be recognized for the health systems, even in countries that were suffering, but also that going forward, the need to protect livelihoods. I think Minouche's points on the importance of a formal sector that allows more flexibility. Marwan, you gave us the five paths to a more stable region. And then, of course, Monica, your points on where we can see not only the oil sector, but generally the economy going in the next few months will be quite important. To wrap up, what I would like each of you please to do is tell us, looking from now until the end of 2020, if there's one policy initiative, if there's one action that has to be made a priority to help us navigate the next 6 months and hopefully have a better 2021, what we need. So Monica, I'll start with you, please, on that question.
I think a lot of the policy measures that I'm going to highlight are already in place. I think number one is to get the balance right between opening of the economy and keeping the COVID cases down. So moving in stages. Number two, protecting the businesses that are still there, that are still in place. But I think most importantly is really coming up with a plan on how to broaden and deepen the economy. The sectors that have got the economies across the GCC and the MENA region to where we are now are not going to provide the same growth and the drivers going forward. At the same time, with the fiscal pressures, bringing in foreign investment, foreign capital is going to be very, very important. So creating a framework to bring that in will be very important. So those a mixture of near term, but also forward looking, and to implement it as soon as possible.
Thank you. Marwan, if I can turn to you.
Jihad talked about avoiding the 3 Ds, Mina: denial, delay, and distortion. I want to add adopting the 3 Is: inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. If there is one policy recommendation I would give, it is that from now on, you are not going to be able to achieve any buy-in from the public, no matter how efficient the economic solution is, unless you bring in inclusion, unless citizens feel they have a voice in decision-making moving forward. Not all economic challenges have purely economic solutions. This is one of them. There is no magic wand that you can wave and solve the economic problems of the region overnight, whether it is the end of 2020 or the end of 2025. You can only do that if the citizens, are convinced that they are part of the solution and not part of the problem. So I will say the 3 Is: inclusion, inclusion, inclusion.
I love it. The inclusion point is so important, but also this idea of the personal responsibility as we get into the next phase where people are being told you're personally responsible, everything from socially distancing to masks to how you interact with other people. But with responsibility have to come certain rights and certain privileges. And I think finding that balance at this time will be so important. Thank you, Marwan. Jihad, coming to you. I know it's difficult to ask you to give me limited policy recommendations since your job is to give constant policy recommendations, but the priorities for the next 6 months.
I will definitely vote for what has been said by both Monica and by Marwan. I would say keep an eye on the pandemic because the risk is not over. And with the reopening, there is still an increased number of cases, and therefore we should not relax. I think this is still the priority number 1, protecting lives, protecting lives, protecting lives. What this crisis taught us, that you can do the undoable and think the unthinkable. I think Minouche mentioned her experience. I think we all went through the same experience in our institutions. None of us would thought that we could work 4 months now or more, working remotely and doing all the things we did. It means we can do things differently. I don't think today we should keep the same attitude toward reforms and toward transformation. We should not be afraid of changing. We should not be afraid of tackling issues that we have tackled in the past, and maybe 9 times over 10 we fail. But I think this is now the time to work on multi-level of policymaking. 1 is focus on protecting lives. B is help bridge the transition from the situation that we had before and the new normal, which requires to extend some of the measures that were designed or adjust them, provide support where support is needed, but more importantly, design the new normal. Because the new normal could be something that is better than what we saw, but it also could be something very challenging, because historically we saw after big events, 2 types of countries: those who use a crisis as an opportunity, as a stepping stone to do major transformation, and those who drag and wait and at the end pay much bigger price. My last worry is we need to keep an eye on the social side of the equation. And I think what would be the 2 major transformations: changing the social system, and the other major transformation, change the way we work. And I very much like what you said, the way we feel responsible, which requires changing the labor market, the education system. It embraces everything. And I totally agree that this is part of a broader inclusion agenda that we need to pursue. And we need to add to it certain additional pieces like resilience, like solidarity among countries, and also among social groups. I think solidarity is going to be also an important silver lining that the region culturally has, and then organize it in a more structured way would be very useful too.
Thank you so much, Jihad. And I think your point about people can't just go back to how things were 6-7 months ago. Certain things have changed forever. Some for the good, unfortunately, some for the worse. Here in the UAE, for those who didn't follow the cabinet reshuffle and the emergence of new ministries and the merging of other ministries, it really is a very interesting example of agility and also reacting to those types of changes that we saw here, where after having the first minister of artificial intelligence, Omar Al-Alama's portfolio has extended now to also include telework applications, to think about how the workforce has to dramatically change. Thank you all for your attention. For those who joined us on the specific Zoom call and sent their questions to us, for those of you on social media, but most importantly, thank you so much to our incredible speakers for your time. This is a huge time commitment, not only what you see live on here, but also in the preparation work. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And we hope to see you in person in better times, inshallah. But if not, I'm sure we'll continue to engage virtually. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you.
You.